We're joined today by Geoff Wohlsen, a gaming industry veteran and the co-founder of Wohlsen Consulting. Thank you very much for being with us.
Hi, Kelsey. Nice to be here.
It's been a very interesting year for Australia in particular. The gaming industry has undergone a few shifts. There have been quite a few regulatory fines which have been imposed, and then there's been a lot more action which is happening to basically curb gambling harm. I'd like to delve into one of the elements of that first, which was the ban on credit cards. I'm kind of confused about the timeline of the implementation. Has that already been completely finalized?
Well, it's funny you should. The legislation was passed by our lower house, which is the House of Representatives here in Australia, and it's a fait accompli that it'll be passed in the Senate. So that was on the 14th of November. So we're set to have this legislation implemented one way or the other. So yeah, it's going to happen.
It's a quite impactful legislation as well. I mean, according to some of the research, credit card deposits into online gaming accounts account for about 20% of the total deposits. That's nothing to sneeze at, right? Do you believe that figure is accurate?
Well, it's certainly plausible. If you look at if you look at the transactions that occur in Australia on a card, some sort of card system or digital wallet, 2022, we haven't got 23 data yet, but 22 says that something like 76% of all transactions occur on some sort of card or digital platform. Now that includes credit cards, and I think credit cards is around about 26% of total transactions in Australia. So I guess if you use that as a guide, you'd have to say that 20% is probably even an understatement. I mean, where card transactions are at their highest are at the sort of quick and convenience end, petrol, supermarkets, food, for example. They're up around the 85% mark on card in total. That includes credit card transactions and debits. The younger cohorts, 18 to 29, are far more active, as you would expect, in using digital transactions. So, they're up around the 85% mark. So you'd have to say this type of gambling, this type of gaming and leisure activity probably attracts, and certainly does attract, a younger demographic. So you'd have to say that it could even be higher, possibly even as high as 30%.
From what I understand from the legislation, it's veered at online gaming activities, right?
It is. It is sports bet mainly and wagering, but what is exempt is lotteries and charitable lotteries.
Okay, and has there been any feedback from the industry so far? I mean, have they decided that this is inevitable, or are they still trying to lobby for a slight reduction in some of the measures?
Some sort of concessions. Look, I don't think so. I mean, they were on notice some time ago. This came out of recommendations some years ago under a previous government. So the smarter organisations would have been planning for this for some time and adjusting their business models accordingly. So, I don't think it's been a surprise to anyone. And if they haven't adjusted their business models, well, that's poor business, I suppose.
Now, I'm wondering from an operator point of view, obviously we saw everything that happened and we saw that the repercussions were both at state and national level. As you mentioned, ASIC, we also saw the OSTRAC investigations and potential penalties. If you were an operator, who should you be most afraid of? Should it be your state regulator or should it be the national authorities?
Well, they've all got fairly significant powers. But the ones that seem to have the greatest powers and the greatest coercive powers, and of course the biggest financial fine capabilities are OSTRAC and ASIC. And in fact, in Australia, the largest fines have now been handed out by OSTRAC. The Australian record in terms of a fine being handed out by a regulator went from 40 million to 700 million. A bank, Westpac, was fined 700 million. And then another bank was fined 1.4 billion by OSTRAC. So there's a trend there, and it's an upward trend. So I would be most concerned about AUSTRAC if I were an operator in Australia. Most concerned in that they have the enormous powers to fine and coerce and require.
I'm very curious though, because the state regulators are also the ones who are granting them permission to have their casino licenses, right? So was there ever any speculation, or were people ever actually quite worried that, the giants such as Crown and the Star were actually going to lose their casino licenses in any of their properties?
Well, when the Bergen Commission found that Crown wasn't a fit and proper person to hold a casino licence at first instance, people were quite shocked about that. That finding doesn't necessarily lead to the fact that they can't hold and operate a casino. Obviously, what was put in place was a round of conditions, conditions precedent for them opening the casino to comply with in order to hold that casino licence. So obviously they're on notice. I think it would be an enormous stretch to take a casino licence off an organisation that is publicly listed here in Australia. I think there are a lot of warnings that would be given first, and certainly fines and conditions placed on the licence. But to actually take a licence away from an organisation that is publicly listed, you're really affecting a lot of mums and dads, shareholders, of course, superannuation funds and the like. So I think that public policy element comes into it as well.
So looking at the pubs and clubs versus the let's say the other operators, what's the split like? Does that vary greatly between the for example, from New South Wales to Queensland? Is it going to be more heavily weighted on one side or the other? Is it kind of common?
Well, the three big states, New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria. In Victoria, the slots are split evenly between pubs and clubs. In New South Wales, the slots are roughly, there's about 90,000 slots in pubs and clubs. And roughly speaking, it's about 65,000 in clubs and the rest, 25,000 in hotels in New South Wales. And in Queensland, we see something like 23,000 slots in clubs and about 18,000 slots in hotels. So, the Queensland and Victoria are fairly evenly matched. New South Wales very much a club market. Interestingly, though, even though clubs have twice the number of slots in New South Wales than hotels, the hotels are chasing down the club market fairly quickly. And in fact, in Sydney, in the metropolitan region of Sydney, hotels have now surpassed clubs in terms of market share. Hotels account for 50 or 51%, slightly more than 50% of the total spend on slots in hotels and clubs, even though they operate roughly 50% of the number of machines. Across the whole of the state, it's not quite past the 50% mark yet. Clubs are still dominant in the regions, but we expect that to happen at some stage. So hotels have been very, very strong operators of slots. There's no doubt about it. They have good locations and they're fairly aggressive operators. They will have a lot to lose if there's any tax play in New South Wales, as hotels will in Victoria and Queensland.
Given such a difference between the legal framework of each state and the freedom that then allows them to establish the rules and then to be able to lobby with the industry itself, do you think that there is an interest on a national level to try and standardize everything in regards to gaming, or is it advantageous to each state to be able to keep its own individual framework?
Well, look, it's hard in Australia. We have without going into too much detail, in order to bring the Federation together, an Australian government produced a constitution that limited the heads of power of its legislative framework to only 50 or 52 heads of power that it could make laws on. And gambling isn't one of them. And so for the federal government to legitimately pass laws that impact on gambling, it has to get effectively the agreement of the states and territories. because if it doesn't, it's liable to be taken to the High Court and have that piece of legislation dragged down as being unconstitutional. Now, I know this credit card ban has been implemented through the Interactive Gambling Act of 2001, which sought to use the telecommunications power as the head of power, the federal head of power under which it could legislate these regulations. And it's done so again using the telecommunications power. So it doesn't have a gambling power, it has a telecommunications power. Now, if anyone challenges that in the High Court, and the High Court says, oh, this is effectively a gambling piece of legislation, not a telecommunications piece of legislation, then it may well be determined to be unconstitutional. So I think the federal government's got a long way to go before they wrestle that head of power, that legislative head of power off the states and territories. I think the states and territories are of a view that they want independence and they don't want the federal government to creep into their legislative framework. So I think it makes sense, doesn't it, for the states and territories to all come under one legislative framework and one set of regulations. But the truth is our constitutional framework doesn't quite allow for it just yet.
I mean, given the propensity for gambling or the openness towards the idea of gambling, do you think that having, regulation or increased oversight is much better than any type of elimination of the activity, given how it's just going to drive it underground?
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's just almost a truism now, isn't it, I suppose? But yeah, look, if we make it too difficult, if we make it unattractive on a land-based, highly regulated within a regulatory framework in Australia, will we see that activity go elsewhere? Well, I think, Economics 101 says if you make product A less attractive and people can switch to product B, which is more attractive, the substitution effect will always happen. So we've got to be careful of that. We've got to make sure that our legalised, regulated gambling activity is fun, reliable, is well regulated, but we can't make it such that it is unattractive. One of the things that the Victorian government did decide is looking at is slowing the real spin down of slots, and various members of the Senate over the last 20 years have talked about a 5-second real spin slowdown. I think they currently run at around about 3 seconds in Australia. Now, if you watch a 5-spin reel running at 5 seconds, it's like living in slow motion. So I think we've got to be careful of those sorts of things that just take away the enjoyment factor. I will say one other thing, and that is that like any system, moving to a cash-based or a digital wallet system will probably require several steps. And we have had a couple of general trials in Australia around digital wallets. And generally what was found is that the need to provide 100 points of ID, which included things like driver's license, passports and things like that, and with several steps in the process, players found it very difficult to get on board. They found it very difficult to get on board. Once they were on board, they didn't mind it. And I think one of the biggest challenges of the industry between now and when something is implemented will be that transitioning of people. So I think it's important for regulators, lawmakers and then regulators, to make sure that there is a grandfathering of whatever those systems are, so that there is an integration of those systems, that it's not a sort of a sledgehammer approach, a hybrid, if you like, period of time to grandfather those systems in. But certainly by 2030, I think we won't recognise what we're doing. There'll be a very different platform for payment and movement of wealth, or movement of some sort of value from one thing to the other. And it won't be cash. We know that.
Well, I'm sure there's going to be very interesting things that are going to be happening. I'm still going to keep at least 1 or 2 bills within my wallet, I have to say. I'm too old school for that. Thank you very, very much for your time. I'm sure that we're going to delve into more issues, and hopefully we can see you as well at the ASEAN Gaming Summit. But thank you for your insights. Geoff Wohlsen, Wohlsen Consulting.
Thanks, Kelsey.